My name's Ken Gibb. I'm the Director of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, or CASH, and I'm going to chair today's event. The event is a joint one with ALACHO, and we're delighted to be doing this. It's called The Right to Adequate Housing, Are We Focusing on What Matters? And it's based around a report and associated materials that Gillian Young from Newhaven Research, Scotland, has carried out for ALACHO. And we're delighted to have Gillian with us, and also Tony Kane from ALACHO, who are going to participate in the first part of this session. So before I kind of introduce all the panelists in more detail, I'd like to say a little bit in introduction about what we're going to do today. So we know that how we have this new human right to housing moving forward in legislation in the new Parliament, and I think the essence of what this work is about is saying, how do we move on from the idea, the principle, into something that can be implemented and operationalized? So Gillian has produced what ALACHO calls a can opener paper, which starts to dig into the issues around the concept of a right to adequate housing. And this is a really excellent paper, which I recommend everyone to read if they haven't done so already. There's an executive summary that I think we circulated as well. And it asks some really important questions about what outcome indicators do we need to quantify adequate housing and the shortfall of adequate housing, and how would we go about making sense of that? What do we think the situation is just now in terms of adequate housing, and what improvements are required to data in order to be able to quantify and measure these things, so that policy can evolve to try to meet the targets that we're setting ourselves. So I think the concepts of progressive realisation and minimum core obligations are going to be ideas that are going to become a major part of the housing discourse in the years to come. So let me introduce our five panelists. I've introduced Gillian and Tony already. Gillian is the Director of Newhaven Research Scotland. Tony is the Policy Manager of ALACHO. Later on, we're going to be joined by Franchia Kelly, the Chief Executive of Blackwood Homes, and the Assistant Director of Shelter Scotland, Gordon Mcrae. They're going to respond to the report, and we'll have a further discussion. And then in the final section, they're going to be subsequently joined by Duncan Gray, who has a long history of doing excellent work around statistics and on homelessness in particular. And the final thing I want to say in this introduction is that we'd be really grateful if people pose questions for the panel, and do that through the Q&A function, not through the chat, but through the Q&A function. And then I will filter them and ask questions as we go along. Although we've got only an hour and we've got a lot of material to get through, I'm sure we'll be able to put many of those questions into the discussion. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Gillian, who's just going to give us a sense of some of the highlights, really, of what the research says. So Gillian, over to you.
Thanks, Ken, for the introduction. In a nutshell, the ALACHO study looked at whether Scotland was well placed or not to track progress against the realisation of the right to adequate housing. And to do this, we agreed to do a couple of things. One was we were going to think about which outcome indicators might be used to define adequate housing in Scotland. And the second thing was really, could we put some numbers around those different outcome indicators? Could we populate those indicators? And to cut a long story short, essentially, we identified 29 indicators that covered the 7 different conditions that make up the United Nations right to adequate housing, and they cover things like security of tenure, affordability, habitability, and so on. Of those 29 indicators, we were able to populate 12 of them, which in itself is quite disappointing, but I think the exercise itself was important for 3 key reasons. The first is that the exercise confirms, certainly to me, that if the Scottish Government wants to put human rights at the centre of policy decisions and budget making decisions, then it's going to have to show leadership. It's going to have to think about how it's going to invest time, how it's going to invest resources to improve the evidence base to allow this to happen. And I think what we learn from doing this exercise is a good place to start is indeed to think about housing outcome indicators. So we'd like to see the Scottish Government work with a range of stakeholders to agree a set of housing outcome indicators around which future data collections could be organised. The knock-on impact, of course, of this would be that councils, RSLs, other organisations involved in the world of housing would have to step up their game, and they need to be thinking about how they improve their own data collection and how they share that with the Scottish Government. I think the second lesson for me is that even the very partial picture that was painted by the 12 indicators suggests that very, very large numbers of households fall short of living in an adequate home. So even if we take energy efficiency out of the equation, we're looking at anywhere up to a quarter of all households in Scotland may be at risk of falling short of having an adequate home. These are really big numbers. And certainly it suggests to me that if there is nothing else we should be doing, is we need to break the link. We need to stop equating the assessment of housing need with the assessment of affordable housing supply. We need to go back and we need to look afresh at the local housing systems analysis approach. We need to develop a much wider and more rounded picture of what we mean by housing need. And we need to be listening to ordinary people about what changes they would like to see in their home and what changes in their living conditions they would allow them to live in dignity. And the reason I'm stressing dignity in all of this is because dignity is what lies at the very core, at the very heart of human rights. And the final point I think I'd make is that another theme that runs all the way through the human rights agenda is accountability. And the United Nations are very clear that good evidence is essential if both national and local governments are to be held to account for progressing the right to adequate housing. But they've also made it very clear that governments have a duty to ensure that private and third sector bodies not only understand, but comply with the human rights obligations that the government, in this case the Scottish Government, and what they're planning to set out in legislation through the forthcoming bill, have signed up to. And so I think that makes it very clear that the Scottish Government and councils are going to have to work together. They're going to have to figure out how they can use regulation and other levers, and indeed the data that they're going to have to collect to ensure that adequate housing, and I think in particular the minimum obligations that centre around things like eviction and anti-discrimination, are being adhered to by all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That's fantastic, and lots of food for thought already for people to think about. I'll move straight on to Tony. Tony, you kind of sponsored this research, and I think we'd like to start by asking you what you think the significance and policy relevance of it is.
I will, if I may come to that in a moment, Kim. But first, if I can, just a little bit of housekeeping, because I would genuinely like to thank Gillian for the astonishing piece of work that she's done in the face of a wandering brief and an occasionally unhelpful client. And it is, I'm genuinely impressed by I'm not surprised, but impressed by the quality of the work that we're looking at today. And as part of that, also to thank the Scottish Government's analysts that I know offered some considerable help in the process of unpicking some of the data. And then finally, Ken, to you and Gareth and Cash for agreeing to jointly host this launch. I think that's a recognition both of the importance of the Commission and the quality of the work, and I'm very grateful for your help in launching it. And I have to say, I'm looking at 108 participants in this morning's session, and I think that also suggests a very widespread interest in the issue, and it's a timely report. Moving on then to the importance of it, I think kind of three observations really. The first one is that we have been very conscious about referring to this as a can opener. The questions that it raises are much more important than the tentative conclusions that it draws. And whilst I think the numbers are helpful in the way in which they frame the complexity of the issue and the relationship between them, they are essentially skeletal. They are indicative at this stage. It's the questions that we now ask ourselves and the actions that we take that will be the most important outcome from all this. I mean, the second point that occurs is that when you look at the range of issues that we've been able to measure and address, I think we take some comfort from the fact that there's nothing new, there's nothing unknown, and very many of them are addressed very directly in Housing to 2040. The questions are the types of questions we've been asking ourselves around affordability, around house condition, around homelessness for a while. What I think this gives us is that sense of the interconnectedness of all of that, but also, I think, a very timely reminder that a focus on the measurable, the standards that we have, shouldn't deflect us from attempting to get a deeper understanding of some of the of subjective measures that sit underneath that. So we understand homelessness to be the most dramatic and the most obvious example of a failure of the human right to adequate housing. But I think we also now start to understand that the mental health impacts of bad housing, of cold and damp and insecure housing, are equally as dramatic and can be equally as destructive. So that takes us on to then the point that Gillian made in her introduction, which is about how this bears on our understanding of housing need, and how that then shapes the way in which we structure local and national strategies, and how we direct resources. And I think these are the important questions that come out of the whole process. The final point would be to just acknowledge that housing is a dual competence. It sits with the Scottish Government and it sits with local authorities. Responsibility for progressive realisation of the human right to housing is something that has to be managed jointly between local government and the Scottish Government and the UK Government, for that matter, rather than something that sits solely within the fiefdom of a single sphere of government or a single set of organisations. This is all our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I should also mention, I don't think I did earlier, but there was a video presentation that you were able to watch beforehand, and I know quite a few people did, so there's obviously more detail in that, and that's another media by which you can get into some of the interesting issues here. I'd like to start, if I may, by asking you both a question, which is really, at one level, this feels like we're kind of entering a new critical period where government and local governments, Tony says, has to try to come up with ways of really operationalizing the thing that they've kind of decided that they want to pursue this road. And by what you've both been saying, this is a really challenging and difficult thing with lots of consequence. A question I'd like to ask, which is just out of my own lack of knowledge in the area, is to what extent have other nations attempted to pursue a kind of right to adequate housing, and do we know anything about their experiences of doing that, or the challenges they've faced, or how they tried to overcome it? Is this so what I'm really getting at, is this really something which is quite globally significant, what's trying to be done in Scotland? Any thoughts?
Might be worth me kicking off, is it, Tony, if that's okay? Certainly, it's not a thing that I focused majorly on in doing the research, but it was still nonetheless obvious that while there are some European countries that have investigated and looked into how they measure and take forward human rights, in particular the right to adequate housing, there are only, as far as I'm aware, one or two countries that have legislated for the right to adequate housing, one of them being South Africa. And therefore I think we don't have any good evidence that simply legislating for the right to adequate housing actually makes it any more likely that governments, national or local, will actually deliver on the commitments that are set out in terms of the right to adequate housing. On saying that, I think Finland is an interesting example, because what Finland have tried to do is not focus on trying to make it a big legal issue, but have tried to focus on how you make sure it drives policy. So they have quite active involvement by their equivalent to the Scottish Parliament in vetting what is happening in terms of what governments, national and local, are doing. And they act almost like the accountable body. So I think that's, in terms of governance, that at least they are making progress. The one other thing I would point out is, when I first started this, I looked around to see if there were any other sets of indicators, if you like, outcome measurement frameworks that covered housing. And what was really striking in all of that is how little housing is covered. There was some early work done by the United Nations back in 2003 to develop some indicators, but it went the way of many measurement frameworks. It fell by the wayside as soon as they started to look at trying to get data to populate the indicators. So in many ways, I think in Scotland, us thinking about this issue makes us ahead of the game, really.
Yeah. Tony.
I don't think I've got much to add to that, other than to point to the quote from Kofi Annan that sits on the front of the executive summary, where he makes the point that we put a lot of effort into defining human rights, and now the phase we're moving into is one of which we realise them. And I think what we're trying to do is start that conversation at a very small scale in Scotland, to the extent that we may or may not be leading a conversation more widely. I think that's interesting, but not necessarily something I would want to get overexcited about. And getting it right locally is the critical point.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the questions that's just come in is from David Stewart, and David says the following: really, Gillian's video on the research highlights that if housing is to be a human right, then housing should be understood as a social good, not a commodity. Does this suggest a tension between the right and ideas about the rights of property and landowners? And if so, how might these be resolved? So is there a tension between a social good rights and property rights as we normally understand them? Any thoughts about
that? My immediate reaction is yes, there is clearly a tension, and it's a tension that appears in the literature. Gillian will perhaps confirm that the UN Special Rapporteur has been cleared about the risk of financialisation in housing as damaging to human rights, and seeing housing as a commodity and a source and an investment good rather than a social good puts the realisation of human rights more widely at risk. I think we're very clear about that, and we have, generally speaking, allowed the rights of property and property owners to predominate in areas where we should have focused on other things. And I think where we are with the legislation in private renting is a good example. We allow a landlord to evict a tenant into homelessness because they've decided they want to sell to realise a profit. I just don't think that's appropriate, and I think it's a debate we ought to have about the way in which we balance those two issues.
Great. Gillian, do you want to add anything to that?
There's not really much to add other than say that what's quite interesting at the moment is if you look at the individual case law in cases where there's evictions and repossessions, it's very striking that in terms of the private sector, the law tends to be very much decided in terms of the rights of the owner to get back their property, as Tony was saying. But when it comes to social housing, there's a lot more emphasis placed on proportionality and looking at things from the tenant's perspective. And my reading of what's in the task force recommendations is if the right to adequate housing becomes legislated for, then there's going to be an obligation, a duty, if you like, on the courts and the tribunal to be looking at the definition of adequate housing and the implications of that. So that might begin to see a shift in the way in which the courts view the balance between property rights and the rights to adequate housing. But make no mistake, there is a tension running through the entire human rights agenda that I don't think has been resolved in the 40, 50 years we've been looking at these issues.
Right, thank you. I've got a comment in here from Claire McGilvery, which kind of points to some things we might talk about later on, but it's not really a question, but what she says is, this is incredibly important can opener. I'd like to see more emphasis on using the panel principles of a human rights-based approach in setting indicators for change in housing, building in strong participation to measure change set by people who need the change most. In a sense, you were saying that, Gillian. Just before we move into the next phase, I'd like to ask you both one final question, which comes from John Mills, who asks, in the context of this important debate, having congratulated you for the starting point of this debate, he asks, can we initially discuss how people who do not currently have adequate housing exercise their rights to seek one? So is there anything you would say about the kind of situation today if somebody says, right, I don't have my rights being met, what can they do about it right now?
I'm going to give you first go, Gillian. Chance to think.
it's quite hard to know what they could do at the moment, because we're not in a situation where the right to adequate housing has got any legal status. Certainly where there are issues for people that have housing condition problems, homelessness, that don't comply with the law, they've always got the courts to turn to. But I think what's much more interesting is the work that the Scottish Commission for Human Rights have been doing, where they've been working with tenants groups to actually get tenants to be able to articulate what their living conditions are like, how that has an adverse effect on their dignity, how that information can be shared with landlords, and how they can act almost like a lever between the landlord and the tenants to get change to happen. And that's maybe something that Claire will be able to talk about more in detail than I am later on.
Great. Tony?
Yeah, I think what John's question does is pose the issue at two levels. The first of all is the strategic, the systemic level. This report is generally focused on how do you develop a policy frame which progressively drives across a number of fronts the right to adequate housing, and how do you respond to individuals who are facing a situation where their home is inadequate. One of the challenges in that is that a significant proportion of those, and the figures demonstrate it, will be in own occupation. We also know that there's a higher proportion of people facing challenges probably in the private rented sector. And single people, single adults come out, I think, as probably one of the groups facing the most widespread challenges. So there's something about understanding that in a strategic context. But the day-to-day is always a difficult choice, in particularly around social housing, where it's a ration system. We ration access to social housing. We have to make judgments. How we make those judgments, I think, ought to be something that we unpick in the context of a human rights approach. And which policy areas we regard as most significant and how we balance them becomes a key issue. Gillian's already said we focus a great deal on homelessness and we focus a great deal on the supply of social housing. We spend less time thinking about the situation of people with disabilities in inadequate homes, people with profound support needs who may be in institutions or other settings that are completely inappropriate, and people who have an urgent need to move but simply can't exercise, simply can't achieve that because of the way the system works. There's always going to be that tension, but I think there's no question that moving on both those fronts simultaneously is going to be part of the answer.
Can I maybe just add one thing to that? One of the task force recommendations is that for the different social and economic rights that would be built into the legislation, there should be a set of minimum standards, a set of minimum obligations, and that's consistent with the human rights expectations. And one of the reasons that they're looking for a set of minimum obligations is that if an individual person or a group of people decide to take action against a landlord or whoever because they're failing to adhere to their human rights, if that case was to succeed, whether it goes through the court system, tribunal, whatever other arrangements are put in place, actually obligations would then fall on both the Scottish Government and local authorities to adhere to those and to make sure that those people's rights were met. So I think, depending on how the bill is eventually framed, we could be looking at a very different kind of governance structure for people to be able to articulate and seek to ensure that the right to adequate housing is delivered. It's just we're at such an early stage, we don't actually know what that governance structure going forward is going to look like in any detail at the moment.
Great, thanks very much. We're right on time. I'm now going to invite Franchia, Kelly and Gordon Mcrae to join us. And thank you for that. And I'm going to ask each of them to respond to the report and what you've heard, really with just sort of three kind of key points you want to raise. And I'll ask Franchia to go first, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you, Ken. And thanks for asking me to do this. I think it's absolutely great to get the conversation sparked, as you've said. And I know Callum's on the call today and he's done work with the Institute. So I think in terms of the housing profession as well, really important that we're moving this discussion ahead. My 3 points really are about the importance of the data, the importance of doing, and the importance of culture. And if I can quickly go through those, in terms of the data, certainly I think there's just so much, as I would expect from Gillian's wonderful work. One of the ones I bring back to myself are human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And that brings me back always to the people. And it might be me the example around the data on older people. And be no surprise that in Blackwood, so older people are going to be enshrined, the rights are enshrined in the bill, then I wonder how that also fits with data on their health and so on. So for us, it's about what's the data that helps us understand people to live independently. The other piece of data around accessibility and around connectivity, connectivity being a hugely important one. I think how we collect data in terms of people's own data in the devices they use will change as we go through this progressive realisation stage. The importance of doing, for me, the accessibility standard, just isn't where it needs to be, but we wanted to demonstrate what could be done rather than wait until everybody was on the same page. And keeping doing the things that we can do as good examples. Good examples aren't enough, but if we don't have them, then the data itself isn't enough in my view. And the third point around the importance of culture, for me, the culture around co-design, around participation, and around our officers feeling positive and confident on this is hugely important. So, and the culture of working together, the relationship and how we work with each other across the organisations in the system will also be incredibly important in terms of changing that culture so that we're all positive about what should be a very welcome development in Scotland.
Thank you very much. That's great. We'll go straight on to Gordon. Gordon, could you give us the same kind of highlighted points?
Thank you, and thank you, Ken, and thank you, ALACHO, for inviting us to take part in this, and to Gillian for the excellent work. This is an area that Shelter Scotland has been campaigning for some time, and I think we've been amazed actually at how welcome this proposal has been. But I think it is necessary for us now to really dig into what does it mean in practice, and I think this report has been described as a can opener on that. I think it is incredibly helpful just to look at it. I think the 3 points I would want to make are really kind of reinforcing the why, looking again about the how, and then sort of reinforcing just some of the ways in which we do it with people rather than to people. I mean, certainly the why for us is, we see the report shows 1 in 3 households, 1 in 4. We've just ourselves conducted some research recently that it's about 1 in 3 households in Scotland, but 1.5 million households, nearly 2 million people, when asked, report that they're struggling with their condition, security, cost, suitability. So we know that in Scotland, we are tolerating a level of poor housing and strain on people's housing situation, and we've tolerated that for an awful long time. We see the right to adequate housing as a lever to try and say we're not going to tolerate the levels of housing inequality, housing poverty. The Scottish housing system is broken and it is biased against certain groups who are more marginalised than others. A human rights-based approach does mean that we have to value the needs of overcrowded households, of people living in damp conditions, and especially people with protected characteristics like discrimination faced by people of colour, disability, sexuality and gender. But in terms of the how, it's no good just having a nice positive statement from government. It means jack all really, without the resources and a real plan to bridge that gap. And I think the principle of progressive realisation is central to that. This is not going to happen overnight, but we're identifying a destination and we need to move there. For us, the real challenge is about how do we bring the people who most desperately need their situation to be addressed by this on board? We know that at Shelter Scotland, none of our clients are walking through the door and saying, I really want the Scottish Government to put into law the right to adequate housing as stated in the UN Charter. But that is this is about how we move from the grand statements to real policy level. I would encourage us to be relaxed about the areas that we don't yet have the indicators for. And I think there's a part of this process is about saying, well, here's what we know now, and here are the indicators we need to have, and that we need to get there and have that commitment. And the last piece, sorry, I'll wrap up here. The last piece for me is this needs to be about more than the housing sector. This is about the economic drivers that sit behind why people continue to see housing as a commodity and what that means. You know, a report out today, or a contribution yesterday from one of the Bank of England economists talking about how the tax incentives of the last year mean the housing market is now on fire. That is we are continuing to prop up housing inequality, and we need to find a way of realising a different approach to housing, a different approach to the idea of need. And I think this is the starting point for us in Scotland to say we can do it better and we can do it differently.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Franchia. Would Gillian or Tony like to respond to anything you've just heard from the responses?
No, I don't have anything to add, but I would reinforce the point, Gordon, saying that as we start to think about how we might put human rights, and in particular the right to adequate housing, into practice, into operation, the last thing we'd want to do is be held up by thinking that we need a comprehensive set of indicators before we move forward. That certainly has never been a view that I would hold or Tony would hold, and it's certainly not a view that we try to get across in the paper. In fact, quite the opposite. I think we agree with Franchia and Gordon that you need a twin track of really trying to progress what can be done at the policy and operational level while you make progress on developing the data.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much exactly what I would have said, to be fair. I think there is nothing stopping us making progress in those areas. We can make progress, and while we're doing that, we can improve our data. And similarly, I noticed one of the questions in the Q&A was about, from colleagues in Wales, around the argument that if you can't achieve human rights, you shouldn't start looking at it, particularly on the supply issues. And again, I think the answer is there's much that can be achieved based on the resources that we have and the knowledge that we have, and the process of achieving that will help us understand the resource requirements and improve our knowledge as we go.
Gordon.
The only thing I would add to that, and I think it touches on the point that Franchia made as well, is about the culture that we need to create around this. Because if you look at live debates just now, like the unsuitable accommodation order being extended, we can get ourselves in quite a defensive position of we don't change the rules until we're absolutely guaranteed that we're going to meet it. And I accept there's a role for us in the third sector on that, in terms of how it's perceived that where we do breach or fail to meet standards, that we're just not clobbering people over the head about it, but we're actually trying to identify the way forward. But I think we all just need to get more comfortable with the idea that we might be measuring things that aren't going to tell a pretty picture for a considerable period of time.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A now. There's a large number of questions coming in. I'd just like to start with one from Tom Kirkwood, which Franchia might be interested in. And I'll just read out the question. It says, can I ask from a neurodiversity perspective, autism, ADHD, LD, etc., what positive practice has been identified in Scotland, especially cross-practice interface, that's housing, social work, health, etc. Can I flag up in Denmark and certain United States that they're starting to show positive action on this? So this is, I guess, partly about this working together, but dealing with things to do with mental health, neurodiversity, etc. Does anyone like to comment on that?
I think I'm not an expert on that particular question of Tom's, And I think if there's good practice in Denmark, then it's absolutely important that we get, aware of that. I think keeping building in the examples, what we're trying to do, as I said, remains incredibly important. So for us, it was about engaging with people to understand the things that either did or didn't work for them and design around that. Now, that might seem like you can't do that for everybody, but you can definitely do it in a way that creates new standards. And I think there's a way of meeting that at the moment with Scottish Government when they're looking at things like, the update on housing for very unique is the example. And trying to do that across tenure is a big challenge. I don't mistake that. But the kinds of things that for autism or ADHD, I think we probably do know some of those, but maybe not enough. Or the kind of things that could be part of either new build or retrofit. I think the issue of retrofit is one you maybe come back to, because that's a big one that we're facing at the moment in the adequacy of a lot of existing housing, and how we all get behind that in terms of how we change it for the future, because it'll need quite a lot of things to be either accessible, adequate, or whatever the other issues are on.
Thanks very much. Does anybody else want to contribute to that question, or will we move on to another question? Okay, I think we'll move on to another question. So there's an interesting question here which builds on some of the things Gillian said earlier, from Tammy Swift-Adams, who is saying that the NPF4 presents a key opportunity to deliver housing objectives through the planning system. How will you bring your findings from this research to the attention of officials and ministers to ensure that they can reflect on it as they prepare the framework? Lack of evidence on existing housing need has been a big issue raised in relation to setting of housing land requirements for the next 10 years. So any thoughts on that kind of tension that's there?
I suppose at one level that's a direct question for ALACHO. What are we going to do now? Might be another way of putting it. And I think we do have to have that conversation. I know there are a number of civil servants in the audience, and we will seek to talk to senior folk in the housing divisions about how best to progress the conversation. We would certainly like to talk to the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary about this. We recognise that she's going to be fairly busy, but I think that is the critical question: is where does it go in terms of a deeper conversation, but not just, as I say, not just in terms of the Scottish Government's approach. There's a question about how local authorities now look at their local housing strategies. What does it mean for the way they're structured, for the way they approach the assessment of housing need, and how they set priorities? I think NPF4 is, in many ways, is one of our difficulties writ large. The framework around it, particularly the HMDA, is increasingly focused on assessing the needs of people who want houses but don't necessarily have them. So emerging households, household formation, and a small element of that part of the population that is homeless at a particular moment. But it's the deeper understanding. There's an assumption that people who have a house can find another one or an in situ solution, particularly around disability across the whole range. But learning disability in particular, it may very often be the case that the house they need simply doesn't exist, and the house that they're in can't be made suitable. And I think we pay too little attention to that.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come in on that? Okay, I have a really interesting question and comment from Glenn Bramley that I'd like to point up, because I think he takes a slightly different perspective on this, and I think that's well worth having that different perspective. So I won't read everything out that Glenn says, because it's quite a long contribution, but what he says: at a more fundamental level, I would question the value and legitimacy of extending a human rights approach to ever wider areas of housing or other needs without considering how far this is underpinned by stable political consensus of support for the proposition. He also points out that resources are scarce and there has to be stable support for absolute prioritisation. And he thinks that there needs to be more broadly across social policy a balancing of priorities and a fair method of rationing. Although he does agree on a practical level with a number of things that have been said, particularly about housing needs and homelessness. So I just wonder, he also says he's particularly struck by the dominance of the energy efficiency issue, which is now the main challenge to be faced. So I guess I just wonder how you would respond to that, that can the human right issue be a kind of absolute in terms of priorities, or must it be nested? And is that part of what this progressive realisation kind of argument is about? I wonder if anyone would like to respond to what Glenn put out there. Gordon?
Oh, sorry.
Well, I'll say my piece and then let you in, Tony. I mean, I think the key issue for me in this question is, it's not necessarily one thing without the other. You know, the taking a human rights based approach is about how we create that foundational level of you know, the obligations are clear. There's a clear expectation. I think from a Shelter Scotland perspective, one of our big issues really is that we continue to see some of these debates within the kind of context of what resources are currently available, and that there's an assumption about it's how do we divide the pie that we have rather than how do we grow the pie, if I can strain that metaphor. And this does, and as I said in my comments earlier, this does require a different response from other parts of the public sector, from the third sector, and from the private sector too. You know, there's another question in there about you know, what are the immediate priorities, and Tony touched on it. You know, we need to decide what our expectations are of private actors in a housing system where we are more and more reliant on them to meet the needs of households who are a long way from a home ownership, who have long-term needs will only be met in the private rented sector in the current time. It cannot be right that we take an absolute view of property ownership that allows landlords to create a burden on the public purse. So I hear the tension in that debate, but I think we can have minimum obligations, a broad foundational set of rights, and then ensure that we are using that as leverage to bring in those parts of the public and private sector that have for too long ignored the impact that they have on the housing circumstances of so many people in Scotland.
Thank you. Tony?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, in terms of a long-term political consensus, I think Glenn's absolutely right, that there's no point. Progressive realisation requires us to agree what progress looks like, and to agree that having made progress, we don't then go backwards. And that, I think, bears on another principle, which is non-regression, which is enshrined in the international legal framework, which is we shouldn't be going backwards, and government shouldn't be withdrawing rights. I think that also speaks to a bottom-up approach to determining how these things should operate, rather than, at this point that's made in the report, rather than the very top-down approach to programme planning and policy development that we have. We need to engage more thoroughly. The panel principles, which I think have been picked up in the comments as well, are part of the way in which you structure that. But the other point I would make is that on the resource issue, I simply do not accept that Scotland is too poor a nation to properly house the whole of its population. I just don't accept that proposition. There is a distributional question to be asked in there. But if the argument is we can't afford this, we can't afford to house 5.5 million people in Scotland in homes that meet their needs, I simply reject that suggestion.
Can I very briefly add to it? I waiting for a stable political census. My life's not long enough. So I reckon we're better to take word in the hand and go for it. And what this does for me is the housing system, with all of the aspects around that, incredibly important and actually very useful that we've moved quite away on that in the discussions in the last couple of years. If it doesn't come back to the people, then you know, we've got our culture wrong. And I do think Scotland can play a very important role for its people in at least addressing this. And you know, if it doesn't work, we should go down fighting on it. It's definitely worth trying.
Thank you very much. If it's okay, I'd like to move on to the final stage now of what we're trying to do in this session. And to do that, I'd like to introduce Duncan Gray and give him a chance to contribute to the session. Hello, Hello, Duncan.
Hello.
So I think you're going to say something about some of the data issues and gaps, and then we'll have a further discussion around that.
Yeah, right enough. Yesterday afternoon, I sat and thought through the issues for people like statisticians and people like me, who are seriously data geeks in a sense. So, but it's important stuff. First of all, I'd say the reaction to the paper, I think I would encourage everybody who's participating in the seminar to read the paper in full and not just the summaries. The paper is extremely well written, and it does tell you, it's a really good introduction to data that's available at the moment. It tells us about what's going on. I think it underpins the fact that we've actually got quite good information in Scotland about housing and housing issues, but that there are big gaps in it. So my first reaction to it was, okay, how would a government statistician, how would the people who are responsible for assembling this data and putting it together and publishing it, how would they react to a paper like this? I think the conclusion I'd come to was that, as always, the main concerns would be the costs of doing it, the burden on people who have to supply the data, what statisticians tend to talk about is respondent burden, and the timescales, how long it's going to take to start to change things and bring about the changes. That ultimately what will happen within government is that the statisticians will have to think about how to prioritise what they're doing. First question you ever get asked when you ask a government statistician for new data is, well, what do you want to drop from the old stuff? Because there are no infinite resources. The thing that I would say very strongly is that statisticians will take their lead from the policy people. That's from ministers and from the policy teams. There is nothing that gets policy people really exercised about data. When something comes up in the public domain where somebody has created a problem, where there's a clamour to put something right, first question statisticians get asked is, how many people are affected by this and how much will it cost to put it right? And if you can't answer those questions, you begin to feel seriously naked as a public policy person. So from the point of view of this, the key thing is getting the push from the point of view of the policymakers, and ministers at the first instance, but the senior civil servants who support them. When I went through the paper, there were two areas of gaps which struck me as important that we struggled with in the past in trying to put data together on housing-related issues. One is to do with the geographies. That in general, with the development of things like the Scottish Household Survey, we can tell fairly good things about what's going on at the national level, but it's very difficult, and the Scottish House Condition Survey, which is now a subset of the Scottish Household Survey, it's much more difficult to draw conclusions at the local level. That's either at local authority level when the planning is all taking place, or even at smaller geographies, which are the sorts of issues that local authorities themselves face. And apart from saying it's very difficult, I don't know if there are any clear solutions to it. The SIMD, the indicators of multiple deprivation, were an amazing development by the Scottish government or by the UK governments, about 20 years ago now, I suppose, in using good administrative data to get good quality indicators of what's happening at much more localised levels. But it's very difficult to do that. It takes a lot of time and effort and work to actually build data that's usable at that sort of, in that sort of way. I think there are some scope in the benefit system for doing that, and I think we underuse what's available about people's incomes, their housing circumstances and other things which is available in the benefit system. It's only one group in the population, but you could do more with it if you were able to get access to the data. The final thing that struck me was, and I'm a great fan of this, is this question of soft data. That asking people's opinions, asking people about how they feel about where things are. You can do that very much in a kind of localised way when you're running an organisation, but also national surveys like the Scottish Household Survey do a bit on that. And I think we seriously underuse the available data that we get on people's opinions and views. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Could I just remind everyone who's not speaking to put their mute on, because there's a wee bit of background noise now and again. Gillian, would you like to respond at all to Duncan?
I think my initial impression is I probably agree with almost everything Duncan said there. The thing that really strikes me is that it is 20 years since the Scottish Index of Deprivation was put together. In actual fact, in those 20 years, we have not made really any real improvement in the housing indicators that are included in there. And I think Duncan's spot on that one of the frustrations in all of that is sitting in administrative systems, including the DWP systems, is data on housing costs and incomes that would really give us a much better handle on the issue about housing cost burdens and affordability at small area level, which would be a lot more useful than the indicators that sit there. But my understanding is that there are still major barriers within the government in terms of sharing data between DWP and the Scottish Government. And because we're moving to universal credit and away from housing benefit, those problems are escalating rather than diminishing over time. And I think we need to be aware of that some of the barriers can only be addressed by the Scottish Government really continue to bang on the door of the departments down south to try and get them to share data better. I think if we kind of move up and look at the bigger issues, it strikes me that one of the things that we haven't discussed that's in the paper that kind of Glenn raised, and I think you've raised, Duncan, is the whole issue about what is it that's most fundamental to measure. And while I kind of agree that if you wait around for politicians to make a decision on the whole set of indicators, we might wait forever, I do think housing need, human rights, both of them are really about normative standards. And we do need to be thinking about which of those standards are most important to address. And I think the one area I might have some difficulty with you, Duncan, is the idea of if we develop a new data source, what data do we drop? Because a lot of the housing data collection exercises have actually been streamed back over the past decade. And if we could have collected data in the past about rent levels and allocations, I don't understand why we've lost sight of those and why we can't reintroduce them. And I think what it tells me, it's all really about priorities and commitment. So I'm not sure I would believe, I know statisticians because they're working with finite resources at a given point in time. But I guess the issue really is for the Scottish Government is if they really want to take forward human rights and they really do want to be thinking about feeding information into their whole policy and resource allocation process, they have to think more seriously about the resources that they commit to providing and collecting and making use of information. And that goes equally, I think, for local authorities, not just the Scottish Government. I mean, my sense is that we have seriously underfunded research and intelligence in Scotland in relation to housing for well over a decade now.
I'm with you there. I think the heyday of the development of government statistics in Scotland was devolution. There was an understanding at the point of devolution that much better information was needed about all the policy areas. But we lost that at the time of, or post-2008, effectively, when public expenditure was being squeezed. And I think we lost some good stuff. I mean, funnily enough, I'm getting into detail now, but the loss of score was, to my mind, very sad. But that was because we never made it work.
Okay, I'm aware we've only got 5 minutes to go. So if it's okay, Tony, unless there's something you really want to urgently say, I'm going to return to the questions. There's a couple of questions. I mean, we can't do justice to all of them. And I think what we'll maybe try and do is try and make sure we can pass the unanswered questions over to the panel to look at afterwards. But I noticed that one of my colleagues, Adriana Sowita, has asked a number of questions, and I just want to pick out one of them that she's asked, which is to say, how do you think the Scottish Government could mediate against the discrimination produced by the right to rent, including the EU citizens that have a difficult time getting digital settled status? So that's a very kind of specific question about EU citizens in the UK who can't settle. The other question that I'd quite like to ask is from Katie Colliver, who says parts of Scottish Government, certain Scottish academics, I guess there's a few of them in cash, are becoming increasingly interested in the concept of capabilities rather than human rights. Have you considered this approach as a way of developing a more concrete metric for adequacy in housing? So 2 different questions, but we've got 3 or 4 minutes left if people would like to respond to either of them.
These are very specific questions and not necessarily within the scope of this particular report or indeed the thinking we've done around it. On the right to rent, I guess my one observation would be that the conversations tend to focus on the way in which it plays or will play in the private rented sector. Public landlords have for a long time been establishing that somebody has access and a right to be here and access to recourse to public funds before they allocate housing. So it's already in place and operating and is already an issue for many people. I'm not stepping into that argument. I think it's something that the Scottish Government and the UK Government need to sort out between them. And to the extent that the Scottish Government is unhappy with the outcome of those conversations, it needs to look to the powers that it has, particularly public health powers, to ensure that EU residents aren't destitute in Scotland. And I think there are probably options there. And a similar question on response on the range around capabilities. I think understand, yes, absolutely, it's a part of the framework. It's about more particularly, it's about seeing housing issues and housing solutions from the point of view of the individual, and it's that point about empowering people. The problem with our system is that it disempowers disproportionately, and there are some people who are actively excluded by the way it operates. So focusing on capabilities and developing a system which responds positively to them rather than simply imposes a set of barriers is part of the answer. One last comment I would make on the data side of things is that it's interesting hearing analysts talk to each other, policy analysts talk to each other, and it's an important part of the conversation in the same way that having the lawyers involved is. But I wouldn't get too hung up. I've always taken the view that if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, you can proceed on the basis that it is a duck. If it tells you it's a duck, then taking that into account is going to be pretty important too.
Yeah, before you threw me with that last point, Tony, I was going to make the point that I guess the capabilities approach operates at the sort of conceptualization level to some extent. The need for those outcome indicators isn't changed at all by taking that different kind of stance, it seems to me. Right, we've got a minute or so left. Does anyone have any final comments? Gordon?
Can I just come in the point about UK government rights and you know, we're seeing this play out just now with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and you know the idea that the Scottish Government have got limited powers in some of these space, or that these powers are challenged. I would absolutely agree with Tony. I think if we take a public health approach to some of these issues, and a public health approach which we already took during at the start of the pandemic to provide services, you know, why does it take a pandemic that may view some people as potentially a source or a threat to other people for us to then step in? I think that a human rights-based approach in its broadest sense means that we should be addressing those issues without that prompt of that. So yes, we don't, and again this goes back to the point, we don't just see human rights on the basis of what the human rights legislation says, but what the broad powers that a state actor has to meet the basic rights of people, however they present.
Thank you. Franchia?
Yeah, it was just a quick one. And again, I certainly don't have an answer to this, but it does strike me that the way we're talking about data is actually not the way data will be collected in the next, now not to talk about in the next 5 to 10 years. And somehow getting our heads around that would really help this overall conversation. So where it's collected, who owns it, and therefore what relationships you need to access it, and the aggregation of the data, so we can tell not just the questions about how people feel, but what they're doing, what matters to them. And if we can work on some of those issues, which I know there's work going on, but it's just bringing it up to almost at national level in response to this conversation and make it part of the conversation. I think that keeps the focus on people owning their data.
Thank you very much. We're kind of out of time, so Gillian, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with? Give you the floor last.
No, I think you'd be best to give the floor to Tony. They commissioned to study after all.
Absolutely. Okay, if that's what you like, Tony.
Well, no, only very briefly. I'd just like to thank everybody. I mean, we still have over 90 folk in the room, and we had over 110 for a good part of the session. I'd like to thank everybody for turning up today. Apologies to those who asked some really interesting questions that we didn't get a chance to respond to, many of which I would absolutely agree with the points that are made, particularly around gendered analysis, for example. What I hope is that all those that have been here today will go back and take this into their organisations and start this conversation, and that we begin a process of developing a deeper understanding of how a focus on human rights can improve housing outcomes across the Scottish population.
Thank you very much. I realise I'm messing with everybody else's time rights now by going over the score of the hour. So we'll draw to conclusion now. But thank you all very much. It's been an excellent conversation, and it's a great piece of work, and I'm sure many people will benefit from it. So thank you all very much. And that will do us today. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.